The following program is a presentation of BaseNet Internet Television.
Hello, ViewPoint listeners. This is BaseNet Internet Television national political correspondent Tony Mazzucco coming to you with episode 4 of ViewPoint. I'm here with our producer and director of programming for BaseNet Internet Television, Ed Jupin.
Hey, Tony.
How's it going, Ed?
Doing well, thank you.
Yeah, we in the Northeast here, at least in southeastern Massachusetts and the Boston area, we've yet to have a lot of snow this year, so I guess it's doing very good.
Well, I finally got my half-inch.
Yeah, I think last night it went from rain to snow back and forth down here near Cape Cod. And for those of you who listen to ViewPoint out there and you don't get snow annually, it's a good thing. You should stay where you are. Before we get into our In the News section tonight, just to remind everyone, you can always find us at basenettv.com, basenettv.com. All of our previous episodes of ViewPoint, as well as all of the other productions that we perform, are on basenettv.com. And anytime you want to get in contact with us, questions, comments, you want to email about the show, about topics, our new email address is viewpoint@basenettv.com. Once again, viewpoint@basenettv.com. So we're going to go right into our In the News section today. And, I'm going to start off with something, and I've got to tell you out there, everyone, I'm getting a little tired of doing the In the News section because it seems like every time I want to discuss what's going on in the news, something or another keeps popping up that is always the same. Something we've discussed every episode of ViewPoint thus far. Can you guess what it is? Iran warns the European Union that oil embargo would be an economic suicide for Europe. So once again, we're talking about Iran. We're talking about what's going on with Iran. And nothing has really happened in the last couple of months. Now what Iran is claiming is that if the EU would agree to U.S. sanctions on the Iranian central bank, which would effectively limit or eliminate their ability to purchase oil from Iran, Iran's economy is 80% oil-based, that it would mean an economic suicide for Europe, that their oil prices, which are far, far higher for oil and gas than they are here in the States, would skyrocket, and that, it would lead to a collapse or something like that. I think what you're seeing really here is that Iran is afraid. Last month, it was military action. It was, threatening to close the Straits of Hormuz. It was wargaming. Iran is really, really afraid that something's going to happen because no matter what the short-term damage or impact to the West and to Europe would be, the long-term result is that the Iranian regime would not survive. The Straits of Hormuz, if Iran were to close that off to world shipping, I think the United States, in addition to, in conjunction with our allies in the Middle East and in Europe, would be able to reopen the Straits. And they wouldn't just reopen the Straits and leave Iran where it is. I think you would see probably attacks on the entire Iranian Navy, not just whatever's involved in closing the Straits. You would start to see attacks on Iranian air forces and airports and in air defenses. You'd probably see attacks on their nuclear sites thrown in there, probably some other command and control, the Revolutionary Guard and whatnot. So I don't think that there would be a limited conflict where Iran closes the Straits, the U.S. goes in, takes out the mines, takes out the ships that are doing it, and, maybe fights off a few of the fighter planes that are involved or something like that. I think you're going to see a wider conflict that's going to end very poorly for Iran because even though everyone has said, and I would agree, that you can't necessarily prevent them from closing the Straits temporarily, in the long term, they're not going to be able to maintain their...
It won't be the Cuban Missile Crisis 50 years later.
Exactly.
Just do some saber rattling and say, okay, we're going to do this embargo, or, close the strait, and then, we're going to run with our tails between our legs.
Yeah, right. I don't think that's going to happen at all. Iran can't stop us from, reopening the Straits of Hormuz, and I think that the embargo would lead to a collapse of the Iranian regime. In theory, that could be a good thing. You got to look at the larger geopolitical context of the area. Syria is on the verge of a civil war and probably very close to toppling. And if Iran were to topple or to go into some serious recession or depression as a result of an oil embargo, I think you would see Syria collapse very, very quickly. And I think that would actually probably be a good thing for the region. It would be a good thing for reducing and eliminating the funding for terrorism. But again, it's all waiting for some critical juncture to happen with Iran. They first threatened militarily, now they're threatening economically. What's next, who knows? But I think 2012 will probably lead to some resolution of the Iran issue. Hopefully not a conflict, but I don't know.
It's about time. It's been going on since the 70s at least.
Well, I think that that's a good point. In a lot of times we forget that some of these conflicts date back so long, and maybe it is time that something finally comes to head. I mean, with an election year in the United States, I don't know to what extent that's going to have an impact.
Well, our liberal friends will tend to call that the October surprise.
And that very may well be. I don't know if the president would make a decision one way or the other to go to war with Iran specifically for an election, for the purpose of winning or not winning the election. But I don't think that he may not be able to avoid it. And people may
actually saw the opposite last night, very late last night, as I was perusing some news. Mm-hmm. So I don't have all the details, but apparently President Obama is looking at it. Economy, war. Economy or war. And he's leaning towards the economy. And a lot of people are saying that, well, in that case, he may not get reelected because he's not showing a strong enough initiative as far as handling Iran and all of these other situations.
That's true. Coming from the opposite side of the spectrum as the president, I don't think a war with Iran would necessarily be that popular. I don't think people would react too negatively to it. I think it's similar to the situation in Libya, where it's like, I think a lot of people had the attitude of, well, we really don't like this, but whatever. But we've also got to see what a war in Iran ends up costing us, what that ends up meaning. Are we talking about just a military action and stuff happens far away from us and, maybe oil or gas prices go up a little bit and then they come down? Or are we talking about something wider? Are we talking about the potential for an impact on the global economy? I think in the event there were to be a conflict in Iran and it were to have noticeable negative impacts on the economy, even if they're short term, that would spell, doom for the president's reelection chances. But on the other hand, if something were to happen in Iran, if it were to be quick, if it were to be clean, if the regime were to collapse, I think that would certainly be a boost. I don't know if it would be enough of a boost to help the president through, because, again, the economy in the United States hasn't changed yet. So he may stand up there in a debate with Mitt Romney or whoever else ends up being the challenger and say, I did this with Libya, I did this with Iran, and this, that, and the other thing. And everyone's going to say that's great, but, the economy's still where it was when you got elected 4 years ago. So take a hike. But we're going to have to wait and see what happens to Iran in 2012. Probably an apex of a year, no matter what. 2012 may not be the end of the world for everyone, but maybe it will be for Iran. We're going to move into a slightly different topic. Sad, but the news from today, 5 more bodies found in cruise ship wreckage. And I've got to tell you, I have a few friends of mine who have been trying to convince me to go on a cruise next year.
Unbelievable. And we have the 100th anniversary of Titanic coming up in April.
Exactly. And it's funny. What was the problem with Titanic? It was unsinkable. They didn't pay attention. They didn't listen to what was going on. It was arrogance, really. What happened here? Supposedly the captain wanted to drive by a island where one of the waiters was from. I mean, you've got a cruise ship
just got a little too close.
Is a massive, massive ship with hundreds of people on it. And you're going to put them in jeopardy by doing something stupid like that? I got to tell you, if that comes out that that's the truth, this captain should spend probably the rest of his life in jail. I mean, I think we have at least 8 or 9 confirmed deaths, but there's another 29 or so or 30 people missing. I'm sorry, they're all going to turn up dead. And I know that sounds terrible, and I know that sounds negative.
Sure, and even if it was just one, it doesn't matter.
You're absolutely right, but I mean, you're talking about gross negligence, gross incompetence that has led to the death of probably 30 people. I mean, it is unconscionable. This guy should spend the rest of his life in jail, and whatever company owns that cruise ship should get sued for everything they have. And they should lose everything they have. I mean, it's, a mechanical failure, a mistake, or weather. I mean, those things are terrible, but you understand them. You can even understand somebody making a bad or a poor decision in life.
An iceberg. Even in the Titanic situation, okay, you could say that the captain was going too fast under the direction of Ursay or whatever his name was, the big boss of the White Star Line that happened to be on board with them, and they wanted to make this record-breaking time from England to New York. Okay, iceberg gets in the way. And, no iceberg got in the way here. The sandbar or whatever got in the way, but that's, again, really, truly human error on part of the captain from, like you're saying, trying to get too close inland.
Exactly. And if you were to complain that the Titanic, that maybe they didn't handle their evacuation well, again,
and come on. Bottom line is with Titanic, you hit a freaking iceberg, you know. So your hands are somewhat tied at that point.
Right.
You know, whether the lookout could have yelled a little earlier or something. Well, you know, could have, should have, would have. But you hit an iceberg, the ship went down.
Right.
I don't think you could compare that to this case.
No, not at all. And I think that's why it's just it's tragic, but it's angering as well. You know, it's somebody grossly just made a decision that was wrong. They should have made a better decision, and it's terrible. I mean, a lot of people lost their lives. That's going to have, I think, an impact on the industry as a whole. Because these big ships, much like Titanic, people don't think of them as sinking. People don't think of them as crashing. You know, nobody hears about a shipwreck nowadays, you know. So I think it's going to have a negative impact on the industry. This guy probably cost hundreds of people their jobs. And he doesn't even realize it, because I think there's going to be a lot of people out there. I don't think it's going to, you know, eliminate cruises from people's itinerary. But I think you're going to have a lot of people here or there who are going to start.
No, and I cut you off. You know, you were just going to say about yourself considering going on a cruise. I'm sure you're reconsidering that at this point.
You know, I am. And it's funny because in all my reasons for wanting or not wanting to go on a cruise, safety was never one of them. I've flown quite a bit. You know, I think everyone, maybe when you fly, you're a little concerned, is the plane going to crash? But, you know, flying's kind of a scary thing. You're in a plane a couple hundred feet up.
You don't really think about that when you're on a boat, no.
Exactly. And you know, what's funny is I was thinking about it, safety had never popped into my mind. Not that I wouldn't fly to California, let's say, because I'm worried the plane's going to crash. But, you know, whenever you're planning a trip, it's always back in, you know, somewhere in the back of your mind. Never once in looking at this cruise would the boat crash and sink remotely in the back of my mind. You just don't think about it happening. And now people are going to worry about it because, you know, one guy was just an idiot. But hey, what can I say? Maybe they shouldn't have let Italians drive boats. Speaking as a descendant of Italians, it's probably a good idea. But that's a tragedy. Hearts and thoughts and prayers go out to the family and to the individuals working in the rescue. And hopefully some good will come of this story, maybe some positive regulation if there ever is such a thing. But just a tragedy. And you know, I guess I keep trying to move on. I keep wanting to go back to it. There was apparently a revolt of junior officers against the captain that said, you know what, no, we need to evacuate the ship. We need to get going. And, you know, good for them. Good for them for standing up and for putting people's safety ahead of their own career or their own stupidity. So I guess maybe there's some bright spots in the story. But we're going to move on to a brief election story before we go to the election update, because I noticed a couple news articles popping in it. A few days ago, the Martin Luther King night debate, little bit of a rowdy crowd. I have not seen such a rowdy crowd in a debate, I would say, yet. They were very much booing. Hadn't seen that really yet. I'm talking throughout the course of the 2-hour debate, there were probably at least a dozen or so times, if not more, where the crowd outright booed somebody who was speaking. And most of them got a boo at least one point or another. A lot of clapping and cheering. I think Ron Paul in one statement got booed at the beginning and cheered towards the end.
I see a lot of booing with Ron Paul. Actually, everybody. I shouldn't just name them. Other than Romney, you know, maybe here or there a little boo or a little hiss for Romney. Could it be, and I know we're going to cover this in a little more detail in a little bit, could it be that just as what Huntsman said, it's time to just come behind the probable eventual nominee here and just quit this infighting, and maybe even the people in the audience are starting to see that, hence these boos saying, you know, why don't you all you guys sit down already and just rally around the nominee? You know,
that could be it. There's definitely, I think, I would never say that these debates are starting to get taxing, but there comes a point where they are starting to get taxing, and I think nothing new is really being brought up, and there comes to a point, well, you know, the primaries are really the only way to get somebody to go ahead or not get ahead. That's what causes somebody to, you know, finally drop out or to stay in the race. So I think you're right. That could be just there's a time of, you know, let's come to some consensus here. We've heard what there is to be heard, and let's go forward. But a rowdy crowd nonetheless. Before we move on to our election update, I do have one other article, since we try to bring you stuff from around the world here at ViewPoint. And the article says, Abu Qatada deportation blocked in human rights court. Strasbourg judge stops UK from sending radical cleric back to Jordan because of risk of trial on torture-tainted evidence. And this comes from The Guardian, which is a well-regarded British newspaper. And I just, you know, I found this interesting that last night in the Martin Luther King night debate, the trial of terrorists and the NADA Act came up, as it seems to all the time. And I think Ron Paul had made a point about how we have caught and convicted quite a few al-Qaeda operatives in the United States without the need for all these expanded government measures. But here in Britain, or not here in Britain, but over in Britain, they apparently wanted to deport this man on the basis that he was a radical cleric. And unfortunately, the UK court, the European Union Court of Human Rights, or European Union Court of Human Rights, blocked the deportation of this man. He's also been called Osama bin Laden's right-hand man in Europe. And I just think this is why when people talk about the UK separating itself from the European Union and whether it wants to be more continental or more independent, and you look at issues like this and you say, the UK courts made a decision based on their safety and their security to deport somebody out of their country. And then the European Court on Human Rights told them, nope, you can't do it. You're stuck with this man. And, on the basis that he might be facing a trial based on torture-tainted evidence. And I'm not going to get into the morality of that one way or the other, but I think that this is not going to help Europe. I think there's a point in time where Europe probably needs to try to draw closer together. I think there's a time where they need to try to make sure they can bring and keep the UK into the fold. And issues like this certainly are not going to help them do that. I think that the UK is only going to continue to move further away from Europe. And the Prime Minister in the UK, David Cameron, is not particularly happy about this incident. But we'll have to wait and see what happens. It's a crazy world out there. And I often encourage people, look at what goes on out there as we look at our rules and our laws and the debates that we have. See what's shaping the debates around the world. I'm not one of those people who believes we should take legal precedent from anywhere outside the country, but it's interesting to see how bad things can get out there. Could you imagine if the United States went to deport somebody that we felt was a threat or we felt wasn't here legally, and some court that was not our own was telling us, no, we had to take the person back or had to not let them out? I think it's a dangerous trend to go down, but luckily it's happening in the UK and not here, at least not as of yet. Well, we are going to move on to our election update, or our election segment, whichever you prefer to refer to it as. And I've got a couple of points here. The first one we'll start with is that Huntsman has dropped out of the race since we last met here on ViewPoint. I almost thought there was less media coverage of this than there should have been. They're jumping all over every small thing that, Mitt Romney says or someone else does. And, they're predicting front runners before they get into the race. And then Huntsman finally drops out. And
I was actually surprised. After New Hampshire, I kind of figured him into at least Florida at the end of January.
I'll have to agree with that. I was a little surprised at the timing. He seemed very positive after New Hampshire, very much wanted to continue, wanted to go, and he didn't have the greatest showing in New Hampshire, but he definitively showed.
Yeah, I really figured him until Florida.
Yeah, and the fact that he waited several days and then dropped out, a little odd. I guess he wanted to throw his support behind Romney before South Carolina. He could have waited a little longer, maybe participated in these debates. He would have been given more of a chance and more people would have looked at him. And given the closeness, the relative closeness between South Carolina and New Hampshire, I think that I'm very surprised he did drop out. But, the media spins these things. He probably looked at how much money he had going into South Carolina. He may not have had the organization. He may not have had the cash. It's also that he may have been betting on a better showing in New Hampshire when he put all his effort into it and couldn't get a better showing. It's possible that he decided it was time to cut and run. I still think that John Huntsman, if Mitt Romney or another Republican wins the election, he will end up being Secretary of State.
I just don't see anybody, we've thrown a couple other names in there, but he really seems to be top on the list for that, top on a very short list.
Yeah, I absolutely think so. I've said this before, I'm going to throw a prediction out there. Even if President Obama does win re-election, God forbid, I think John Huntsman has a solid chance of being Secretary of State.
Yep.
I think that his experience and his credentials, I think that it would give the president a way to sort of reach across the aisle. And John Huntsman not being very conservative, at least in the mold of a Santorum or something like that, or a Perry, I think that he has a very good chance to be Secretary of State, whoever wins. And I even said that when John Huntsman was polling at 2%, when nobody knew who he was, and still people don't know who he was. I said, I have a feeling that this man's going to be Secretary of State either way.
Yes, you did say that quite a while ago now.
So we'll have to wait and see what happens. He didn't really burn any bridges on the campaign. He really didn't hurt anyone too much. To the extent that he's going to campaign for Romney, probably back in Utah, he'll help him. But let me tell you something, Mitt Romney's going to win Utah no matter what. I don't know if John Huntsman is that big national figure that's going to draw a lot of help to Romney, but I think, here and there he'll throw in his support. I think what Huntsman might do is because he appeals to a lot of moderates and independents, he might try to attach himself to those groups and those individuals to try to help Romney out. But I don't think his support's going to make too big of a deal. Although, if he had dropped out before New Hampshire, it might have been that Romney would have won absolutely handily.
So, is this all over after South Carolina, or do any of these other three top-tier candidates still have a chance? I say it's. I was reading again very late last night that now it seems to be that it's coming down to the top two, Ron Paul and Mitt Romney. And I think but I'm going to throw in Santorum and Gingrich yet also.
You know, Santorum had his moment in the sun. I'm glad he did very poorly in New Hampshire. Couldn't keep that momentum up. Gingrich is polling very well in South Carolina.
He was expected to win South Carolina for the longest time.
He was, so he's still doing very well, and he had a great night at the Martin Luther King debate. So, I mean, he's doing fantastic. But, you know, Perry also had a wonderful night at the Martin Luther King night debate. But, again, I think his time has passed. If there's going to be a challenger that isn't Ron Paul, they have to come in second in South Carolina, and it needs to be a definitive second. If Mitt Romney wins South Carolina with 38% of the vote, and then, you know, Ron Paul's got 22%.
Yeah, no, that's it. It's all over.
Well, I think Ron Paul will stick out. So let me leave him for if Romney wins 38%, and then, you know, Gingrich wins 26%, it's over. I mean, he won handily. So it's really going to depend on what happens in South Carolina, who drops after South Carolina. Again, I've always made the prediction Perry might stick in a little bit longer because he's got a lot of money behind him. He's just going to kind of do it. I think it could come down to Mitt Romney and Ron Paul, and I think that is a fascinating Super Tuesday premise. And I think it's a good thing for Ron Paul. Just as Mitt Romney is, and you know, you had said this in our last episode, Ed. Actually, let me bring this point up. You mentioned a lot of people think that Romney can't seem to get past this 25, 30%, you know, hole that he seems to be in. But another way to look at that, everyone, is that he won Iowa and he won New Hampshire. And if he wins Iowa, I'll have to check the facts, but it's rare that somebody would win all three. That's not a definitive close, you know, front runner from very early on. I don't think that President Obama won all three. I don't think that George W.
Obama lost New Hampshire to Hillary. Hillary came back at the last minute.
I don't think that George W. Bush did. I believe he lost New Hampshire to John McCain. So I would have to look back and then I think Bill Clinton was similar to Hillary. Didn't he lose Iowa and then win New Hampshire?
Or the opposite. Because that's why they called him the comeback kid then.
Right. So, I mean, rarely does a candidate win all three. So if Mitt Romney wins South Carolina, we've got to be realists here. Here's a man running for the Republican nomination that won Iowa, New Hampshire, and South Carolina. I mean,
and he's way ahead in Florida. The polls have him looking ahead to the next one.
That's a wide range of support. But I'll throw this in there too. Ron Paul has consistently gotten between 20 and 25% of the vote.
Now, do you go back to the way our founding fathers saw it, and we did do it for the first 3 or 4 presidencies? The second highest vote getter becomes vice president?
Oh, no, I never really ascribed to that. I understand why, and I guess in theory, we complain about all the bickering that goes on in our country and how divided we are. If the number 2 person had to become the vice president, I have a feeling our government would work a lot better. You know what? I'm going to go here. I'm going to go on the fly here and say I'm now changing my opinion of that system. I had always thought it was a terrible idea, but I think it would actually bring the country together. And I can guarantee you both parties would absolutely hate the idea of it.
I've always liked it just for the simple fact, or the same reason that I don't like or agree with the Electoral College. I think a democracy, I don't like to say a free country because how free are you? Everybody's got their hands tied. But in a democracy where the people's vote counts, allegedly, and it really doesn't with the Electoral College, the same thing here. Why not have go by popular vote? Whoever gets the highest popular vote is president. Number 2 is vice president, and that's what we did initially.
Yeah, and you know, I think it's an interesting proposition in looking again at the polarization of the country. It would force people to bring people. It would force the presidency to really bring people together. You'd really have to work with somebody from the opposite party in the office of vice president, and it would give, I think, a sense of balance to the White House. I'm sure everyone could come up with arguments on the other side, but maybe it's something they should consider. maybe someday, President Obama or Mitt Romney or somebody out there is going to pick a member of the opposite party to be their running mate. And, maybe we can stop being such a big party country, so to speak, or two big tent parties. But it remains to be seen what, and I think we're still planning on a vice presidential episode of ViewPoint where we talk about all the vice presidential candidates. And
yes, because even then, before the general election come November, they're going to have one vice presidential debate.
Right. So at some point we'll have to, and I'd like to have even a pre-selection.
Yeah, even before we know who it is, let's throw some names into the hat, as we have already in prior episodes mentioned New Jersey's Chris Christie.
Right. I'd seen an article recently, I think it was posted by Basemet, that Christie said he's not ready yet, but he might be ready in 2016.
2016 and 2020, he says he's ready.
So
we that's in our little red book. We said that several weeks ago or a couple months ago that more so if the Republicans lose in November, it's all Chris Christie in 2016. If Romney wins in 2012, then obviously Christie wouldn't be running for president in 16.
Right. I'm going to make a prediction before I move on to I want to have a discussion about Ron Paul, but I have a friend of mine who is somewhat very liberal, who lived in Massachusetts under the tutelage of Mitt Romney, despised him very, very much, but has even admitted, and I think I mentioned this before, that she would somewhat accept Romney if I believe the exact words are, if one of them had to get in, I would be okay with it being Romney. So coming from somebody who's a liberal, who had to deal with him in Massachusetts, which for those of you outside of Massachusetts, Mitt Romney, I wouldn't say was a polarizing figure, but you either loved him or hated him. So I guess that's the definition of a polarizing figure. So for somebody from that, with that persuasion to say that they'd be tolerable to the idea of a Mitt Romney presidency, I think is an indication that Mitt Romney is going to win a lot of support from moderates and even probably from some Democrats. Whether that remains to happen, whether that happens remains to be seen. Just
jumping the gun, there was a CNN poll released yesterday in conjunction with some other organization whom I can't remember. But the CNN/somebody poll yesterday says it's a dead heat between Obama and Romney if the election were held today.
Yeah, I've seen that. Those polls are interesting. They're probably always going to show a dead heat.
But I think as recently as a week or two ago, I saw Obama ahead in a poll like that by at least 8 points.
It's possible that it's come down because I've seen them both ways. I've seen a couple where they say that generically Romney's a few points ahead. It all comes down to what states. It all comes down to those battleground states that we like to talk about every 4 years. It's unfortunate Obama is going to win California just as Romney's going to win Texas, although California's 54 electoral votes is, a fifth of the election.
Yeah, it's huge.
But, it's going to come down to Ohio. It's going to come down to Pennsylvania. It's going to come down to New Hampshire, Florida. We're going to have to see what happens with these swing states because, that poll could be based on a generic nationwide poll. Well, yeah, maybe half the people in California are supporting Barack Obama, but what does that matter? He's going to win it anyway, when only a third of the people in Florida are actually supporting Mitt Romney or Barack Obama or however it ends up being. So as I always caution people, be careful about the polls. But as I've said all along about this election, it's very, very difficult to unseat a sitting president, but the president is vulnerable. This is not a one way or the other election. And short of some cataclysmic event in the negative, it's going to stay that way. I don't think there's one cataclysmic event that is going to happen that is going to automatically propel the president into winning the election. The economy can't turn around that quickly. For it to all of a sudden be booming for everyone to, sort of adorate over the president and have him win, something negative could happen. God forbid it happen. The crisis in Iran, the European debt crisis, once again spiraling out of control, that could cause us to sink into recession. Because remember, we can sink into a recession a lot faster than we can, jump out into growth. That can happen over the course of a couple of weeks, whereas, again, the economy starting to boom and pick up takes many, many months and even a couple of years to happen. So I think we're probably going to see polls somewhere in the middle up until right around the election, right around election.
All I could say is come election night, I better not be up all night and then still not find out who the victor was until the middle of January.
Yeah, I remember when George W.
Don't need another 2,000.
Yeah, I remember going to bed that night and I had to get up for class in the morning or something. And really thinking disappointedly, of course, that Al Gore had won the election because I think they might have called Florida.
Oh yeah, they sure did. I think NBC was the first one to call it for him.
And I went to bed and I was like, oh, that's disappointing. I really didn't want Al Gore to win. And then I woke up in the morning, put the news on because of course that's what I do. I go to bed at midnight watching the news, and I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and have to turn the news right on because God forbid something happened in that 5-hour interval that I didn't know about. But I put the news on, and I'm like, well, what the hell? We don't know who the president is. What is this?
And we didn't know for a month and a half.
I've got friends of mine that are still very young, still doing their undergraduate degrees, and, they start talking about politics and elections, and I'm like, and I'm not that old myself, but I'm like, I'll never forget the images on TV of some guy with glasses holding up a ballot and, looking at the hanging Chad and whether or not that counted as a vote. And,
oh, yeah.
One of the more embarrassing incidents in our electoral history. But, it's funny you mentioned the Electoral College, which you said you didn't support. I don't have a problem with it. I remember getting frustrated that a lot of people were upset at the Electoral College after that, and they were upset that, somebody had won the electoral vote and not the popular vote, when that had been technically possible for, decades. And it was a lot of, Monday morning quarterbacking. Well, if we didn't have this system, this wouldn't have happened. Well, before the election, nobody was complaining about the system. It's people started to get upset when it stopped working.
I don't know. And see, but that's why I call it a democracy, not, saying that we live in a democracy and not that we're necessarily free. That's what I meant by hands tied.
Right.
The popular vote ultimately doesn't decide the presidential election, and nobody could dispute that because of the Electoral College. So, I don't know. I think leave it up to the popular vote. We the people, let the people decide. I think that's why the first half a dozen or so presidents were decided by popular vote.
That's true, but remember, we are a federal state. We are not a unitary state.
No, absolutely.
Russia and the UK, for instance, are unitary. No, Russia actually is a federation, but the UK, for instance, is a unitary state. There is just a national government.
No, absolutely
we have
right.
different levels of government, and that's how our system is designed to work. If we wanted to change that, I could see that, but then the argument against it, I guess, has always been that smaller
There's talk
states,
quite often of doing away with the college.
Right. Smaller states have never really. It would take away a smaller state's ability to have an impact on the election, because yes, 3 or 4 electoral votes is not very much, but 3 or 4 electoral votes can swing an election, whereas the entire state of Rhode Island otherwise is never going to swing an election. Sorry to those of you who listen to us from the lovely state of Rhode Island, but you otherwise wouldn't have any kind of an impact. The only thing I'll say about the electoral system, if we're going to change it, the way they should do it is they should make the change in the law effective for at least 20 or 25 years from now. Because I think, unfortunately, there's a lot of people out there who would want to change it because they would see it to their immediate political advantage to have it go a different way. And I'll give you an example in Massachusetts. When the Senate seat that Scott Brown took from Ted Kennedy, several years before that seat became open, because a Democrat was appointed in the interim, originally the governor was the one who would appoint an interim senator in Massachusetts. And the Democrats changed that in Massachusetts so that the governor could not appoint an interim Senate seat. This was Mitt Romney was the governor at the time, and that the legislature would do it. However, or it was the courts, or I think it was there had to be an election. Yeah, that's what it was, is there had to be an election. However, fast forward a few years later, Ted Kennedy finally drops dead. Deval Patrick is governor, and people talked about wanting to change it back so the governor could appoint a senator in that entire interim period as opposed to having an election. So it blew up in their face. But they made a decision based on politics. They changed that law in Massachusetts because Mitt Romney was governor and they didn't want a Republican to be able to appoint a Republican to that Senate seat. That's wrong. And it blew up in their face, and I'm glad it did. I think it's the same thing with the Electoral College. If we're going to change it, we've got to say, hey, you know what? The next 4 or 5 presidential elections, we're still going to keep it. But after that, it's gone. And it's a long-term change. We know we're going to change. But it reduces anyone from really being able to try to make that push or make that decision based on a current political climate in the country.
And all of that Tony just said and more, everything, I'll tell you, I'm not always a fan of Wikipedia, the so-called book of knowledge, but everything you want to possibly know and more is, if you just look up Electoral College on Wikipedia, quite extensive. And I recommend people do that and read up a little about it.
Yeah, I mean, I got to tell you, I a little side note here. I really do enjoy Wikipedia. Sometimes you pull something up and it's just so detailed, and it really is a encyclopedia online with just a lot of stuff. And I mean, I think in the modern era, at least for people like me, where would we be without Google and Wikipedia? And, you know, am I doing any detailed research, pulling anything from Wikipedia? No, but when something comes up, you're able to just look it up real quick, get an idea of what it is, and go. I can tell you, as I've completed a master's degree over the last few years, you know, just sitting in class and in a term or an incident or something comes up in class and you don't know what it is, and you just you Google it real quick, pull it up on Wikipedia, and
those
right
are the
away,
first two places you go, and everything you need is right there.
Exactly. You know, you're right there and in the conversation. And I want to have a brief conversation as we move on. Ron Paul has complained, and I think some actual facts have shown that have proved this true, that he's probably being ignored by the media, and he's not getting the same coverage as the other candidates.
They've been saying that all along. That's happened in the debates themselves. There's been a couple of the early debates where he was tossed 2 or 3 questions, given about 65 seconds in the entire debate.
Right. You know, I'm not one given to conspiracy theories, but I think this is dangerous for our democracy. Not Ron Paul, but the ignoring Ron Paul. And it has nothing to do with his views. It's for whatever reason, the media really is ignoring Ron Paul. He should have had front-runner status for most of these debates, and he's not. He's kicked off to the side. They give him questions to try to make him, sound kooky.
They tend to use your analogy that you've been using in the entire time that we've been on the air with this show now. The crazy, goofy old grandpa. You know, and that's how they look at him. They don't take him seriously.
Right. You know, I think that's wrong because he's consistently getting 20 or 25% of the votes in these primaries.
Right.
And he's won some of the straw polls. And nationally, he has a lot of support. I mean, if you look at it, that Ron Paul represents, you know, 20...
Well, I think most people think that his supporters are goofy, crazy people as well.
A lot of them are, but, you know, I think that if he represents a quarter of the Republican Party and not the evangelical base, I mean, that's a significant support level. And it shows in his fundraising, it shows in the votes that he's getting. I think it's dangerous for our democracy that everyone's, well, Ron Paul did well, but he'll never win. Well, Ron Paul, you know, he just can't win. Well, why not? He can get a quarter of the party to support him. Mitt Romney's not getting very much more of the party than that. And everyone says he's imminently electable. You know, we're dismissing somebody who I think has shown that he actually has a lot of support. And whether you like him or not, I'm not saying I'm 100% behind everything Ron Paul wants to do. When Mitt Romney gets up there on the stage with Barack Obama, it really is going to be more of the same. A little bit more regulation, a little bit less regulation.
Oh, it would be a lot different with a Ron Paul up there.
Exactly. And it frustrates me that, you know, people are saying that, you know, they want something different and they're tired of the left and the right and the bickering, you know, that goes on. And he's the one person out of all of them who genuinely is offering something completely.
I heard a soundbite off of mainstream media. I want to say it was Fox, who surprisingly enough is, you know, being viewed at least by the public as a conservative-leaning network. You know, a Chris Wallace or something, they were having a discussion about the front runners, and Ron Paul's name came up, and you hear one of the people on the panel just snicker and say, yeah, well, let's just keep the conversation to the people that are going to win. Yeah, you know, what? You know, who are they to decide for us who's going to win or who has the potential to win?
Right. You know, and I've moved from, you know, agreeing but not really supporting Ron Paul to supporting him more now because he really is not getting a fair break. And if he was polling at 3 or 4%,
that's different.
Go right ahead. Ignore him, whatever, make jokes about him. But he's not. He's consistently representing a certain, you know, a large segment of people. And he is the only candidate out of all the Republicans and the president who's actually saying here is a different path. Here is a different way to do it. Here is a different analysis of our problems. Because when you boil it down, and I'm a fan of Mitt Romney, but Barack Obama and the Democrats and Mitt Romney and the Republicans, all they're saying is this. Our problems are either too much or too little regulation. They're either too much or too little taxation. It's either too much or too little government. And Ron Paul is phrasing the argument completely differently. Nobody else up there is talking about monetary policy. Nobody else out there is talking about real economic policy. Ron Paul brings a good point. Nobody up there is talking about freedom. Nobody up there is talking about this adventurism that we have in our foreign policy. Let me tell you something. I've always been somewhat of a neocon in foreign policy. I mean, I grew up as a kid and in high school in the 90s. And I grew up in the post-Cold War America era where, you know, we were sending troops everywhere and we would just intervene anywhere on anything. And we had a lot of great successes with it. And somewhere in the late 90s, I read Pat Buchanan's A Republic, Not an Empire. And it really blew my mind. I mean, if you can picture, you know, a sophomore in high school that I was reading Pat Buchanan's books. But, you know, it really blew my mind on a different take on foreign policy and on what a republic, not an empire, really is. And him and Ron Paul have clashed quite a bit, but they're of the same vein. And I think we really do need to start looking at you know, a different way of approaching things. And I guess that's what frustrates me about Ron Paul is everyone wants to dismiss him, but I have not heard another candidate with a fundamentally different approach to most of the issues that we face in this country.
Well, the only one is your buddy with his 999 plan.
Right, and you know, it's funny, a commentator on, I think, Fox News said that, you know, they missed hearing the 999 plan, and I think that was what attracted a lot of people to Herman Cain is, wait a minute, here's something that's different. You know, they asked the question on the stage what everyone would pay for a tax rate in the Martin Luther King debate, and you know, for what they think the most somebody should pay for a federal tax rate is. And, you know, I think Rick Perry had a good answer when he said 20%, it's, you know, it's simple, it's this, take your deductions, 20%, that's it, send in your taxes. Ron Paul said nothing because he thinks, you know, there's a way to get around doing it. But you look at, you know, the Romneys, the Santorums, and them, and, well, you know, a top tax rate of this and a slightly lower rate of this. And, again, it's more of the same. I've even had people say to me that, you know, not to continue to defend Herman Cain, but, you know, maybe it is time to just start fresh, just hit the reset button. Because you know what? Twinkling with the tax rate.
Our tax program is so ridiculous.
It is, and that's why a lot of people say, you know, we've got to throw it out. We've got to look at doing something.
Our president of BaseNet TV, Fred Boaz, who's also the host of our show As We See It, he posted something on Facebook, big, long, full page on Facebook, and it was the scaled-down version of the tax code.
Oh, I've heard that story.
Yeah, he says, here's our tax code, and I'm just perusing this thing over, which is a full page on Facebook, and I put in a simple little comment like, yeah, okay, well, there's the problem. I don't know where this starts, where this ends. This is so convoluted. This is so confusing. This is ridiculous. This is exactly the type of thing that they've been talking about in the debates, that we need to do something with our tax code. Half a dozen people jumped all over me. Well, I understand it. This is fine. This is simple. Leave it right it is. What are you going to change? You know, I'm sorry. If you understand this, you're a much better man or woman than I am, because I certainly don't freaking understand it.
Therefore, listen, I've got a friend of mine, and he understands the tax code because he does taxes for big companies and stuff like that. Let me tell you, when he starts talking about what he does at work, right over my head. And I'm an intelligent person.
Yep.
And this friend of mine is far more brilliant than I am. I cannot, you know, he's married to a lawyer, another friend of mine, and the both of us sit there, goes right over our heads, cannot remotely understand what he is talking about when he starts actually talking about taxes. People talk about closing loopholes in the tax code as if it's some easy sort of, oh, just close the loopholes. Well, nowhere in the laws are written, here's the loophole, you can just do this and save millions of dollars. But it's because we have such a complicated tax code system. And, you know, I don't mean to get off on a discussion of taxes, but I honestly think, let me backtrack here and give a little bit of history for everyone. I don't know if I've mentioned this on ViewPoint or not before, but if you read Barry Goldwater, the gold standard of conservatism in America in the 20th century, he'll even tell you the Republican Party since the 20s in this country has had a fundamental split between a base and a establishment, a more conservative base and a more business-friendly establishment. And that split between the conservative and the establishment has been around now, we're looking at over 80 years, 80 or 90 years. And it has manifested itself several times over the last couple of decades, different areas, and it's coming up now in foreign policy and in taxes and whatnot. So that's existed for a while. And I have a friend of mine who often says, well, you know, rhinos, Republicans in name only, win elections, and moderates win elections. And I don't think that's actually true, because when George W. Bush ran as a Republican, he ran as a conservative, was perceived as a conservative, and he won. Reagan ran as a conservative, was perceived as too conservative to win, and he won. John McCain, far too moderate, lost. Gubernatorial election in Massachusetts recently, you had a guy running named Charlie Baker who was as fair-haired and moderate of a Republican as you can get, and he lost to a liberal governor. But that split has been around for a long time. And if Ron Paul were to, well, in the recent elections where the Republicans took the House, he was upset, this friend of mine, that several Tea Party or several, you know, conservative senators lost their elections to Democrats. And he says, you know, we would have won those elections if they hadn't been Tea Party candidates that had won their nominations. And I said I would rather lose an election on principle than win one with somebody who's not really aligned with my views, because I don't think that that's going to help the country. I don't think that's going to move the debate or the discussion in this country in the direction that I think it needs to go in. I very much do not support President Obama in his reelection bid. If Ron Paul were to run for as a third party candidate, and my vote in Massachusetts isn't going to count anyway, but if he were to run as a third party candidate,
sure it is. It's a Super Tuesday vote.
Well, that's true. But if he were to run as the third candidate, and everyone would be upset that that would take away votes from the Republican nominee, I think I would still vote for Ron Paul, just because I would rather lose an election on principle than elect somebody that's not really aligned to my views. And I love Mitt Romney, don't get me wrong, but because he's been ignored, because the party and because the country refused to look at and accept thinking about a different way of doing things, because they focused so much on winning elections rather than developing solid public policies and promoting those policies, win or lose. When all you do is craft policy to be the most acceptable it can be, to be get the most votes it can possibly get, at some point you lose. And we've been doing that for decades in this country. So I'm going to throw that prediction out there that if there's a third party candidate and it's Ron Paul, I might vote for him, even at the detriment to my own party, just because I'm tired of the Republican Party really ignoring its roots. And I'm tired of this country not looking at an honest to God different way of approaching things.
I have said that people that know me know that I am a Hillary Clinton supporter, as I'm a huge Bill Clinton supporter. I have said over the past several months that depending on who the eventual nominees are for either party come November, I just might write in Hillary's name. Yeah. And so, it's the same as you using Ron Paul. I've said the same exact thing about Hillary.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that, it frustrates me because the people that are the most vociferous tend to be the most generic liberal or the most generic Republican. And that bothers me. I mean, you want something different. I think, a lot of people on the left, and this is going to be just a shot at the left, but they'll say, well, we need change. We need something different. And what they mean is they need somebody more liberal and somebody more progressive. Right. I'm not saying we need somebody more conservative. I'm saying that, here's an honest, different approach to our problems. And Ron Paul is not an evangelical, which a lot of people think that as you move further to the right in the party, in the Republican Party, that they're all, crazy Christian, right-wing nuts, which I take offense to that. But I also want to point you that evangelicals weren't really a part of the Republican base until the mid-'70s. So that could change again. And black evangelicals, of course, are generally not Republicans. So I think that's a bit of a misnomer there. But I think that there's possibly frustration brewing, and I'm basing this on my own opinion, that, Ron Paul is being ignored. And I think that's why his supporters get so behind him, is that, he keeps getting ignored. But you know what? I hope he keeps fighting, because, again, I would rather see it tear the party apart, just go along to get along, because I think too often in this country we do go along to get along, and it's not as good as everyone makes it out to be.
So do you have a prediction for South Carolina, looking ahead to Florida in 2 weeks after?
I think Romney is going to win. Second place is going to be either probably Paul or Gingrich. I have a feeling that come the day, Romney's going to win big, and Paul will probably come.
It's going to be another New Hampshire.
Yeah, I have a feeling that it's going to be Romney and Paul. Gingrich could do well, but I have a feeling that the day is going to come. And South Carolina is fairly conservative, but they have a history of picking more moderate candidates if you look at the last several election cycles. So despite that they're more conservative and a conservative might do a little bit better, I think Mitt Romney's going to win. And I think it's going to be Romney and Paul, because I think a lot of those other people are going to be like, do I want Romney? Meh, I'm going to go with Paul. So I don't think Paul's going to win, but my prediction is Romney's going to have a very big win. And after that, it's going to be him and Ron Paul going into Super Tuesday. And I think Romney's going to win the election, but I think Paul's going to call him to task for quite a lot of things. I don't think it would happen, but right before Super Tuesday, I think a Romney-Ron Paul debate would be fantastic.
Now, if Ron Paul does hold up in the numbers as he has so far in the 20s, is a Romney administration almost, entitled to give something in the administration to Ron Paul and say, hey, look, you fought me thick and thin through the primaries. You were consistently at 23, 25%. Obviously, you've got a strong backing. They give him some kind of position?
Here's the thing. I don't think Romney would pick Ron Paul as the vice president.
No.
Unless he really, it could happen.
Unless the numbers were that strong, maybe.
Right. I mean, I think that in the idea of some kind of a grand compromise or a grand bargain, Romney might want to pick Ron Paul, and with the understanding that he'd only serve as vice president for one term. And Romney could say, I'm picking Ron Paul because he's absolutely right about our Federal Reserve and this, that, and the other thing. And that's going to be what I'm going to task him with as vice president. And Ron Paul might like the idea to be able to go after the Federal Reserve as vice president. And going into the 2016 election, if Romney's running for re-election, perfect chance to pick up somebody else for vice president.
Yeah, because by then Ron Paul's 80 years old-ish or something. So, yeah, exactly.
As for another position, Ron Paul's already said he's not running for Congress again. I think he has what he wants to get done. I don't think he is going to want to be White House Chief of Staff. He's not going to want to be Secretary of State. He's not going to want to be Secretary of Defense. The only thing would be maybe a possible vice presidential pick of Ron Paul to get his supporters on board and to really...
I know. Give him Timmy Geithner's position at the reserve.
No, that's the next thing that I was going to say is, if Romney really wants to, shake things up, maybe he will say, hey, I'm going to put Ron Paul in charge of the Federal Reserve.
Nobody likes Geithner. Everybody wants Geithner out anyway.
Yeah, Perry made a crack about him last night. Perry was explaining his tax plan. He's like, you take your income, you subtract your mortgage deduction, you got your charitable deduction. He's like, that's it. Take 20% of that and send it in. He's like, it's so simple. Timmy Geithner could figure it out and pay his taxes on time. And I laughed, and I'm like, oh, poor Tim Geithner. But no, if Mitt Romney really wants to change this country and really wants to do something great, he'd put Ron Paul in Timmy Geithner's position or something similar to that, or even maybe put him ahead of some oversight committee or a presidential committee or commission on something. But I don't think Ron Paul is looking for another job. I think short of something that would really give him the chance to go after the Federal Reserve, or again being vice president for a term, I don't think he's not going to be, oh great, I'll be Secretary of Education. He doesn't care about that. And again, his biological clock is ticking.
I'll tell you, Chairman of the Fed could be it.
It'd be great, and I think that would really, really lead to some changes in the country. But we'll have to see what happens, whether or not they'll strike a bargain. But I don't think Ron Paul would want any other position. Again, you might see one of these people crop up being, Secretary of this or Secretary of that. I don't think Ron Paul will take anything other than maybe Secretary of Commerce or the head of the Treasury or something like that. And I think that's all we had for today. As we move on, I'm going to do a brief on the lighter side. January is when we celebrate Martin Luther King, and I would just encourage everyone out there to actually spend time and go read everything that Dr. King wrote. There wasn't as much as you think. He had several books. They're all fairly short and fairly easy to read. I highly recommend The Measure of a Man by Dr. King. You'll really get a deeper understanding and appreciation of the man, far more so than the media portrays, and far more so than is taught in schools nowadays. Everyone gets taught the I Have a Dream speech. They get taught about, protesting and buses and the dogs and the water cannons. And I don't mean to diminish that in any way, but I think we really miss getting to the core of who this man is and really, truly understanding him. He's a far more influential and inspiring figure than the stories they tell on the surface. And I think if you really start to read everything that he wrote and read his words, he's almost somewhat misrepresented in the modern era, so to speak, by both the media and by education. You'll really get in tune with the man and in tune with his faith and his real vision for America. And it's very, very inspirational. So I highly, highly recommend everyone, Ed, if you get a chance here at the library, pull up anything that Dr. King wrote, especially The Measure of a Man, because I think you'll find yourself pleasantly surprised by really how wonderful a lot of what his writings were. And I think we should go beyond just, not that there's anything wrong with community service, but saying, oh, it's Martin Luther King Day and everyone likes to post positive messages on Facebook and, maybe we're going to go up and clean some trash. We'll really get to the core of who this man was, and you'll really find out why he was such an inspirational figure.
Tony's turning into a libertarian. You're starting to sound like Ron Paul.
I keep moving further and further to the right, Ed. They say people get more conservative as they're older. I don't know where the hell I'm going to be when I'm 70.
And before you wrap up, we have a birthday today, January 17th, which is the day we're recording this show. It's our First Lady's birthday. Michelle Obama's 48 years old today.
Happy birthday to First Lady Michelle Obama. And with that, we will leave you all. We hope you join us again at BaseNet here for ViewPoint. And be sure to check us out on basenettv.com, www. Real quick, nobody ever says www anymore.
No, you don't need to, because you don't even have to enter that into browsers anymore.
Right, but I like saying it, so I'm going to keep saying it. I miss the days of www. And people would ask you when the internet was young, oh, how do you get there? Is it www? As if there's ever...
I think it was more pertinent when George W. was president, because everybody would say www.
Well, that's what I loved about the the Bush years is I would always get to type www just to piss people off. But once again, it's www.basenettv.com to find all of our videos for all of ViewPoint and all the other shows we do here at ViewPoint.
And the new email address, ViewPoint@BaseNetTV.
Yep, ViewPoint at BaseNetTV, ViewPoint at BaseNetTV. Call us send us an email rather with any comments or anything else that you have. We'd love to hear from you, and we hope to all see you soon. And we stay tuned for episode 5 of ViewPoint.